Welcome to Terrible Lizards, a podcast about dinosaurs with Dr. David Hone and Izzy Lawrence. We're starting a very flappy flap heavy Series 7 with the original pterosaur, Pterodactylus. Hello and welcome to Terrible Lizards. We're going to start this series of Terrible Lizards by not talking about dinosaurs. Isn't that right, Dave?
Hardly at all. For ages we've got a vast, or about 4 or 5 series of episodes lined up on pterosaurs, because we've done pterosaurs a little bit, but I wanted to do them more properly and I'm running out of dinosaur things to talk about.
Trying to get you off the subject of pterosaurs is difficult because this is a passion of yours, Flappy Flaps.
They're the other group I do, so I'm largely known as a dinosaur person. In fact, I'm mostly known as a tyrannosaur person because of the Tyrannosaur book, even though I've written only a handful of papers on tyrannosaurs.
And you got very small arms.
Yeah, that's with only 2 fingers. But yeah, pterosaurs is... I was not quite where I started, because my master's project was on dinosaurs, but my PhD thesis was mostly on pterosaurs. So I started on pterosaurs, and I've always split my work more or less 50-50 between dinosaurs and pterosaurs. Probably more dinosaurs by now, but not by much, maybe 60-40. So they are a big part of my research and interest.
And to be fair to them, they are, still reptiles. They're around at the same time.
And they're very close relatives of dinosaurs, so they are broadly regarded as the sister taxon to the Dinosauromorpha. So in other words, dinosaurs plus a few of their immediate ancestors, and then there's a split there, and the other side is pterosaurs, or pterosaurs and a couple of their ancestors. So they're very, very nearly dinosaurs, while not actually being dinosaurs.
And they're also included in every child's picture of a dinosaur in the background with the volcano.
Well, so, I mean, you have to. I believe it's a legal requirement somewhere. When you become a paleo artist, you're told if you're drawing a big scene, volcano in the background, pterosaurs.
It is a requirement, and also it's one of those ones that not many people can name them, because there are a few that I can name, mainly because I just like them, like Quetzalcoatlus and obviously Rhamphorhynchus, and that's the thing. But the one that everybody can name is the pterodactyl. They don't even know the word pterosaur, but they know the word pterodactyl.
Yes, and I'm trying to remember if we've talked about this before, but whether or not we have, we're going to do it properly this time, and where we get all of that from. I should say, actually, before we even start, for anyone who hasn't listened to the one properly pterosaur episode that we did back in, I want to say, Series 2? It was really quite a long time ago. Yeah. We did an introduction to pterosaurs episode. If you haven't heard that, or even if you have heard it before, might want to go back and listen to that again before we go through the next few weeks of this stuff, because it's going to be very pterosaury, and I'm not going to go all over that stuff. But starting with Pterodactylus and pterodactyls and pterodactyls. So Pterodactylus, as it is now, is a small pterosaur, only about 1 metre in wingspan, give or take, at adult.
That's still big, though. That's still, bigger than a blackbird.
It is, but in the grand pterosaur scheme of things, across all pterosaurs that we have, there are not many pterosaurs that are under 1 metre in wingspan. That is about the smallest adult pterosaurs that we have. And Pterodactylus is a pterodactyloid, so it is one of that more derived group of pterosaurs who fundamentally have relatively large head, a relatively long neck, and a relatively short tail. And Pterodactylus is about as small as a pterodactyloid gets. Pterodactyloids in general are much bigger than the earlier pterosaurs. So in that way, it's a bit of an anachronism that it's about as small a representative as you get of the group of big pterosaurs. And it's still, again, actually pretty much one of the smallest. So it's kind of an oddity in that regard. But it's also synonymous with pterodactyloids and indeed pterodactyls, inverted commas, and therefore by extension pterosaurs as a whole, because it was the first ever properly described and named pterosaur.
And it was, when you say it was the first described, we're talking, pterosaurs were around, were they before Megalosaurus? They must have been just after Megalosaurus.
So in terms of the science, yes. So Megalosaurus are early 1800s, 1817, 1820-ish. I can never remember the exact date. Who cares? First, well, it's one of those things where it's I can't remember every date of everything. If someone really wants to know, look it up. It's on Wikipedia. And many, many other places too, but Wikipedia's pretty good for that kind of basic stuff.
And after Megalosaurus, it was Iguanodon.
Yeah. And then with Thichodontosaurus and all the other stuff's coming at that time. Yeah, anyway. But at least a written description, though not named, was 1784.
Nice.
So the 40-odd years before the first dinosaur, we've got pterosaurs. And the original Pterodactylus specimen that this is all based on is a magnificently complete specimen. It is about as good as a bracket flattened pterosaur ever gets. It basically complete every bone. Every bone is really nicely preserved. There's only a few little breaks and cracks and little things like that. Doesn't have any of the wing membranes, but it's really, really nice. And that obviously is a really good head start when you've got a brand new group. That contrast that with lots of other things we've talked about in the past where scientists are struggling with bits for decades. We've got, oh, here's a whole one. Oh, good, we know what we got.
Where was that specimen from? Do you know?
Of course I know. So Pterodactylus, perhaps unsurprisingly, came from Germany, and more specifically the Solnhofen region of Bavaria, so where we get Archaeopteryx from. Though Archaeopteryx, of course, wouldn't show up for another 70 years at this point. But those lithographic limestones, as they're called, and they're called lithographic because they were used for lithographic printing. One of the things that was nice about them is when you split them, you got really nice, flat, clean layers, which is really good for printing. So that's why people were quarrying this rock. And the locals were building and cladding their houses out of it. If you go to the Solnhofen today and you just go to local houses, every single house has basically limestone-coated walls with ammonites in it because they're just so common and they've been around for so long. So yeah, people were quarrying this stuff and they were finding fish and they were finding plesiosaurs and other stuff. And then they turned up this thing, which was clearly new. We don't know exactly when it turned up. So the particular famous specimen, anyone who's seen it, it's actually quite familiar because it's got that kind of head thrown back posture that actually Archaeopteryx has, and many animals have. Lots of dinosaurs that do this.
That arching thing, is that because the spine contracts when it dries out? Is that what's going on?
Yeah, well, so yes, drying out is one way that it can happen. Drowning is another way that it can happen. Certain types of poisoning, which cause muscle contractions, is another way that it can happen.
Oh, tetanus. That's what happens when you get tetanus. You get seized.
Yes, I think it does. Epistotonic.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the type of poison it is that does it as well. There's a certain type of poison.
Strychnine, I believe, does it.
Strychnine, that's right. And it's really quick. I like poisons, but strychnine is like a really good one because basically you go...
Strychnine's a good one, right?
Yeah. Because you taste something bitter, and then in like 5 minutes later, you have a little pulse shock, and it lasts for like a second, and then like 10 minutes later, you have another one, it lasts for 2 seconds, and it gets longer and longer, and about the 5th one, your back fully arches, and you're like, and you asphyxiate because you physically can't breathe because all your muscles have tensed up. It's really quite nasty. Don't do that to each other, children.
Anyway, going back to pterosaurs. So yeah, if you've seen the original Pterodactylus, it has got a really nice big head, but it's usually photographed and shown with the head the right way up, and therefore, if you like, the rest of its body going up the page or up the photograph with its wings splayed out. It's a really, really beautiful specimen. I was lucky. It's held in the collections in Munich. I was lucky enough that I worked there for a couple of years, so I saw this a lot. Got to have it on my desk and play with it. Nothing to be said after 250 years that hadn't already been said, but it was still nice for me to see.
But that's really cool because you've got this rock and it's the one. So it's like, it's a really lovely thing though because it connects you with all the other paleontologists and you're like special.
It's genuinely one of those rare specimens that it's properly thrilling to think about the actual history of this and what it means. It is in its way the foundation of the entire field. So the description of this thing is 1784, I think it is. And done by a French or a Dutch guy? I can't remember now. It doesn't matter. But back in this era, you had this phenomenon called the Cabinet of Curiosities. So people who were very wealthy, you'd have your stag's head on the wall and your fox brush and things like this. And they would also then started getting together just interesting things, literally curiosities. And then you'd have a hummingbird's wing from the New World and a fossil snail, or what turned out to be an ammonite, and so on and so forth. People were accumulating these things. And then people started to write down and draw what they had. And these are kind of the earliest museums and even museum catalogues at this point. And so for this one case, we have a museum catalogue from 1760 that doesn't have the specimen in, and then one in 1784 that does. So at some point in that window, it came into the collection. So we don't know quite when it was dug up, and we don't know quite how it got there, but clearly it was in that period. Slight aside, to everything I'm going to say now, some specimens, I was going to say recently, this is what happens when you've been in a field for too long. Recently, I think now about 15 years ago, now I think about it. Recently, Attila Ossi and some colleagues in Hungary published a paper because they found they had a couple of pterosaur specimens, including a very small Pterodactylus, sitting in their collections, and dug through the paperwork and found out that it predated 1784. So in fact, we definitely had pterosaurs in collections before that date.
But just owned by rich people who said, "Hey, look at this funny little rock."
Well, that's how it always worked, of course. But I'm still going to carry on with the plough through the story of Pterodactylus, the main one, because that's the one that everyone knows, and of course that is what history is still attached to, even if it turns out that there was a couple of others sitting in other collections. So this very, very nice drawing and very brief description of a weird animal, it's pretty much all it was given at this point, comes out in the 1780s, and immediately a whole bunch of people see this thing, or at least the drawings of it, and try and work out what on earth it is. We've talked about how, the early dinosaur reconstructions people were hampered because they just didn't really know what they were. This is 50 years earlier, and frankly, it's a pterosaur. It looks much, much weirder. And so you get these magnificently weird reconstructions of them. A bunch of people thought they were swimming. They were found in rocks where all we'd found were swimming things, fish and plesiosaurs and rays.
I was going to say, I'd have thought they were swimming things.
So it was reconstructed like this penguin-like thing with, what we now call the wing finger, having some kind of big flipper on it. Several people early on said they were flying, but thought they were mammals. So we have because bats, big long fingers, flying, teeth, bat. So had bat-like reconstructions. There's some possum reconstructions where they've got very possumy little faces and ears and look very cute. There's a famous early one, I think it was done by a British guy, but it's got sent to a French journal, but I'm probably misremembering, where basically took the wing finger and bowed it into a semicircle until it reached the ankle and basically gave it round wings. And so it had this little furry, round-winged gliding mammal reconstruction of Pterodactylus, which is rather
Wasn't
neat.
The eye, though, a big giveaway? Did it not have the bones in the eye preserved? Or is that just a dinosaur?
So we don't have a sclerotic ring on this one.
Ooh, yeah.
Pterosaurs had them. Quite possibly it was prepared away. So as an aside, Helmut Tischlinger is a legendary researcher in Germany who's done incredible work with UV light and has found loads and loads of hidden structures and things and fossils because stuff glows under UV that doesn't show up in regular light. So stuff we didn't even know was there, turns out is there. Helmut, I remember, told me once he went over a whole bunch of historical pterosaur collections in the Solnhofen, and he reckons something like half of them probably had soft tissues at one point, and it all just got prepared off.
That's annoying.
Partly because people didn't know it was there, often because they actively got rid of it because they didn't think it was very interesting, and people just wanted the bones.
Can't, like some hawks and that see in UV, can't you train those to become paleontologists?
Bit late. But anyway, very good point, but no missing. But still fairly early on, it was worked out to be a reptile, and the person who really gets that credit is Baron Cuvier, the famous French anatomist. Have we mentioned Cuvier before?
Not sure if we have.
I'm not sure we have. So he was like Richard Owen is famous for being like the great British anatomist who kind of brought that to the public, etc. Cuvier was the same thing in France, but 50 years earlier. And was a phenomenal anatomist and was doing lots of very, very cool stuff. He gets name-checked in a Sherlock Holmes story, with a particularly nice one, where Holmes says something like, just as Cuvier can reconstruct an animal from the smallest bone, I can reconstruct a crime scene from the smallest clue, or words to that effect. But it shows you like how famous Cuvier must have been, that even a century later, you name-check him as someone who can work out biology from little data. So, pretty good at what he's doing. But
also you have to remember that Sherlock Holmes was being written by Arthur Conan Doyle as an insufferable know-it-all with no soul. So,
But anyway, so Cuvier ends up writing a paper, A, where he calls it a reptile, big deal, B, where he says it was flying. Lots of people had said that already, but still, he's getting it down there. Again, because he's Cuvier, everyone was reading this, which makes a big difference in terms of getting the information out there. And C, he also names it. initially misspelling it as petrodactyl. Which of course still actually translates because petro for stone, so stone finger, and actually still works as a name. But the rest of the time he calls it pterodactyl. So ptero wing, dactyl finger, it's the wing finger. So that's him really saying, no, this is flying, and that's what that finger is for. Hyphenated, this wasn't a formal scientific name which were being used at this time, but it was a kind of almost nickname at this point. And so that's where pterodactyl comes from. Pterodactyl from the French and pterodactyl in English as this kind of Anglicization or common name for these types of animals. And it really was these types of animals because, not surprisingly, not too long after this, a load more of them started showing up. Frankly, they'd probably been dug up already, but of course now everyone's made one famous, and they're looking at them, etc. And everything got named Pterodactylus. So shortly after his pterodactyl, he actually, no, I should properly name this. Pterodactylus is its proper name, doesn't have a hyphen, puts it in italics, calls it a genus, does everything that we say you should do to make it a proper formal scientific name. But everything that shows up gets called Pterodactylus. First Rhamphorhynchus, oh, that's a Pterodactylus. The first Pteranodon, oh, that's a Pterodactylus. Like everything. I was trying to check a couple of names for the early ones on this, and I somehow clicked on, God knows how, I ended up on the Dutch Wikipedia site for Pterodactylus, where someone insane has gone through and checked every misnamed thing that originally got a name. And Pterodactylus has, I think it was 70 odd that I counted through.
Wow.
So 70 odd random pterosaurs, a lot of which are Pterodactylus, but got named Pterodactylus, often with a new species suffix, but including things as different as Pteranodon and Rhamphorhynchus. So everything was just Pterodactylus. And by extension, everything was called a pterodactyl. And so that's where that comes from. And if we haven't really done it before, so yes, now the proper name for the group is pterosaurs, not pterodactyls. They are pterosauria. Yeah, that's what they are. You will see some people arguing, going, oh, well, pterodactyl is just the anglicized version of pterodactyloids, or even Pterodactylus itself. And it's like, well, you can try and argue that, but that's never really been the case. I think that's a post hoc justification for pterodactyl still being a word that we should use describing pterosaurs. And A, as I say, I don't think that's really the case. It's an after justification. And B, that actually only clouds the issue, because if some people are using pterodactyl to mean Pterodactylus, and some people are using pterodactyl to mean any pterodactyloid, and some people are using pterodactyl to mean any pterosaur, that's actively confusing the issue. And if there's one thing I'll happily say about scientific names and technical terminology, is that it adds clarity. So I don't really like pterodactyl, not because I think that people using it are fundamentally incorrect, or that it's wrong, or you should go around going, no, don't use that, it should be pterosaur, but because it actually doesn't help the issue. It is confusing as to what pterodactyl actually is, and therefore I think it's preferable to talk about pterosaurs. If you want to talk about pterodactyloids, talk about pterodactyloids. If you want to talk about Pterodactylus, call it Pterodactylus. So there we go.
That's very good. I think my mum is, anybody's going to, if she sees any flying animal, even if it is a bird, pre-Cretaceous, she's going to call it a pterodactyl.
Yeah, probably. And again, I can't really moan about that any more than I would someone who doesn't know and isn't really interested calling Dimetrodon a dinosaur. That's something that has sunk into the public consciousness, and there's very little I can do about that, and I'm not going to get upset about it. On the other hand, if someone genuinely wants to know and is interested and is talking about this, I'll happily explain that to them. And I'll also say, on a perhaps slightly snide note, it's actually very useful for weeding out loonies. Well, so when you get emails, in particular when I have to deal with the creationists, and they're going, oh, scientists don't know what they're talking about, look at all these pterodactyls. And it's like, okay, so if you think pterodactyl is the proper word to use when arguing with a scientist, it really shows how little you actually know.
Exactly. I mean, and similarly,
brackets, same with anyone who writes T-Rex.
A Christian would use the word Sibboleth with you and would be like, I don't know what. So, it makes
Fine. So that is... Cuvier is responsible for pterodactyl becoming pterodactyl, and also pterodactylus, and naming it and getting the whole thing going. And then pterosauria as a name came up in something like 1804, maybe 1815. So not too long after, in the grand scheme of things, that we decided, no, these are a proper separate group, that they need their own name, and we've got enough different things here that we need to start spacing them out. And then, obviously, not long too long after that, people went, should something like Pterodactylus really be in the same genus as that thing with the great big long tail and the weird fifth toe and the little neck and the weird head? No, that's different. Let's call that Rhamphorhynchus, and so on and so forth. That said, the taxonomy of Pterodactylus is still an unutterable nightmare, and it's probably one of the worst things about pterosaurs is that the taxonomy of Pterodactylus is a complete mess, which is a pain when there's so many good specimens of it out there.
I know, I'm just going to say there are great specimens of it, so how can it be? Because normally you're going, oh look, we found this one vertebrate that's slightly different, therefore we can say that this is a separate species. Why is the most famous of all of the pterosaur species a pain?
First of all, because a lot of the specimens are not that great. There are a dozen or so spectacular ones, and then a lot that are much less well preserved. That's the first problem. Second problem, you've got juveniles. Loads of them are juveniles, even very young juveniles. We've talked all about ontogeny and growth and development in dinosaurs and how things change. All of those same issues apply to pterosaurs. In fact, to a degree, they're even worse in pterosaurs, because pterosaurs do some weird things with their growth that other animals, or at least other close relatives like dinosaurs and crocodiles and even birds, don't do, which means that some very juvenile pterosaurs look a lot more adult than you'd expect for their size. So they have a bunch of adult features that they get really early. And of course...
Is that because they can't have big, heavy heads when they're flying?
I think it's not so much the heavy heads. Some of those growth things go into it, but more just that they're annoyingly weird. This is really what pterosaurs are. But at least part of it is, yes, they need relatively solid bones. So they do get more they fuse up some of their joints, which animals would do much later, and they have more ossification and less cartilage than a lot of animals would have for their ages. So yeah, juveniles can look a lot more adult than they actually are. For a long time, we of course didn't understand that. Coupled with that inevitable history of 200 odd years of people naming every damn thing when they first dug them all up, a whole bunch of them have gone into random collections because they were available in large numbers at the time. Everyone wanted one. So there's stuff in the Carnegie Museum, and there's stuff in Paris, and there's stuff in Hungary, and there's stuff in London, and all over the place. So they're all over there, and then they got named independently of everyone else by another 6 people who weren't paying attention to what everyone else was doing a continent away, and so on and so forth. And lastly, the problem which is really still bugging us is even when you've got rid of that stuff, even when you've got rid of the nonsense of, no, every single specimen is not a new species, when you've got rid of, no, that's just a little one, it doesn't need a new name, there is an actual still fairly fundamental question of how many species are there, even among the good specimens. And a good analogy for this, I think, is something I've probably used before on the podcast: birds in your back garden. You know, something like the British ones I always refer to immediately, you know, blue tits and great tits. They look very obviously different when you look at them. One's mostly got a blue head, one's mostly got a black head with a stripe on it.
One's slightly larger.
Yeah. You know, strip all the feathers off, strip all the muscles off, flatten them, remove a few of those bits.
You're channeling my cats again.
Yeah. And then add in another 30 or 40 of these at various different sizes and degrees of preservation and blah-de-blah-de-blah-de-blah, and all the different orientations, because remember, almost all of these are flat. So some of them are flattened side on, and some of them are flattened top down, and subtly different angles, which will shift all your proportions or angles or conceal stuff. How many have you got? And the answer is not sure.
I mean, I'd struggle if it was like, you know, a gibbon and a human, to be honest. I'd just be going off the size.
Yeah. So all of that, you know, 2 very closely related animals that look very similar to each other then coupled with all of these problems, will be very hard to tell apart. And then there's this general question of how different does something have to be before you name it as something different? And of course, we've been down that alley dozens of times before. And Pterodactylus is another one of those. Most of it, I think we have worked out now. Some really thorough revisions have eliminated a lot of the problems. So as a slight aside, the Solnhofen, as we said, there's lots of Pterodactylus, there's lots of Rhamphorhynchus, there's actually a good number of Archaeopteryx and other things. There's loads of other pterosaurs as well. It is one of the productive sites for pterosaurs. There was a study probably 15 years ago now, and the numbers have almost certainly shifted as a result. But it said something like 70 or 80% of named pterosaur species were from 4 sites.
Wow.
Yeah, because when the preservation situation is just right, you get all of them. And when it isn't, you're lucky if you get some bits. And the Solnhofen is one of those. And so it's not just Pterodactylus and Rhamphorhynchus, the two most people have probably heard of. There's Anuognathus and Scaphognathus and Altmulopteryx and Gigepteryx. Oh no, Gigepteryx is Chinese. And Ardiodactylus and Cycnoramphus and loads of others. It is extremely productive, and there is a good dozen well-preserved, well-recognised that everyone's pretty much happy with genera from there. And most of them are very close relatives of Pterodactylus. So if you get into your pterodactyloids as a whole, so all of these, on average, bigger pterosaurs with a big head and long neck and short tail and other things. One of the big groups of this is called the Tinochasmatids. Ctenochasmatids. Tinochasmatids, but spelt with a silent C.
See, I'm just going to think of a lady called Tina now.
Tinochasmatids, and Pterodactylus is one of them, and most of the other Solnhofen stuff are Tinochasmatids as well. So that was at least part of the problem, because it was quite a long time until we worked out that a lot of these small baby things, because obviously babies all tend to look like each other from different species, grow into various different things. Chris Bennett, who I've probably mentioned before, and when we do an episode on Pteranodon, the name Chris Bennett will come up endlessly. Chris is a phenomenal anatomist and a brilliant pterosaur researcher. I think he writes the best anatomical descriptive papers of anyone pretty much ever. Not that, of course, I've read every anatomist paper, but, absolutely brilliant. And Chris did a lot of work. His big thing is Pteranodon, but he's done a lot of work on the Solnhofen, and he was the one who solved an awful lot of these and worked out that, no, that tiny thing is actually a juvenile Gemanodactylus, and that tiny thing is actually a juvenile part of Archaeodactylus, and sorted out a whole bunch of those and did some extremely thorough taxonomic work.
He'd probably get a very good job in a egg factory sexing chickens. It's hard to sex a chick.
I'll pass it on.
Saying to make a bit of money.
I imagine he's happier teaching anatomy at the university he works at.
Oh, probably.
But so that was at least the other part of this problem, is that it's not just a question of, have we got two things of Pterodactylus and quite what are they? There's actually this whole smear of close relatives living alongside them. And again, to take a bird analogy, go down the beach and look at the gulls. Yes, there's some really big ones, and there's some rather diddy ones, and there's some with some unusual proportions that are fairly easy to tell apart, but there's an awful lot of them, which again, once you account for some crushing and breaking and growth, look
bits missing,
awfully similar to each other. And this is also exactly what you'd expect. You don't expect there to be one species knocking around. There is a lot of food in the oceans, and Solnhofen region generally is considered a kind of Mediterranean, obviously not in the Mediterranean, but in terms of its temperature and general environment. It's a lagoonal system, so we have big coral reefs, we have loads of little islands, it's this whole archipelago, and then beyond the reefs you've got the ocean. And what we're mostly getting is stuff that's preserved inside the reefs, so where the water is relatively calm in the lagoonal system, it's sinking into an anoxic layer, so an oxygen-free region where decay is very slow, but there's still deposition, either from the rivers or from tides and stuff like this getting over the reef barriers, and then that's burying stuff. And of course, with low oxygen, low decay, gets buried, stuff preserves brilliantly. And that's why you get things like squid and jellyfish preserved in the Solnhofen.
Which is crazy.
I know, but it's also where you get lots of things like beetles and flies, stuff that you wouldn't normally get in the marine system because it's coming just off the coast. It's coming just off those islands. So although it's fundamentally a marine fauna, we get lots of terrestrial stuff, including the occasional dinosaur. And so put all this together, and yeah, we're back to this problem of actually we'd expect there to be a bunch of closely related species. We'd expect closely related species to look very similar to each other, and it's hard already among living species to tell exactly how many species you've got. And then we're missing most of the evidence. So what are there? So Chris Bennett did a big revision of both Rhamphorhynchus, actually, which I think we mentioned in our Rhamphorhynchus episode from the previous series, where it went down from Peter Vellenhofer took it down from 13 or 14 species down to 5, and then Chris took it down to 1. And Chris did a similar revision with Pterodactylus and went, well, we've already got rid of most of them, but frankly, there's just one here. But that has been revisited, and most recently by Steve Vidovich, and Dave Martill, who this was Steve's PhD basically, and he in a couple of papers he revised a couple of the weirder single specimens of some of the larger ones actually, but then also had a real go at Pterodactylus itself, and he concluded that there were two genera there, and split it into Pterodactylus. Of course, we keep the original name, but also a thing called Aerodactylus. Ooh. They are so similar that obviously most people for the last century or so have considered them both Pterodactylus. And even now, every time I go to do any work on this animal, I have to go back to Steve's paper and look through his list and go, which ones exactly, again, did you say are in Aerodactylus? Write them down and then check through my list of Pterodactylus. Go, oh, not that one. Oh, and not that one. And a couple of others. And in particular, it includes a pair of specimens which are pretty much the best preserved pterodactyloids, full stop. Because they're not just they're flat, problem, but they do have the winged membranes, all of them.
Wow.
Including the Europatagium or tail or leg membrane that goes between the hind legs, which almost never preserves. That is extraordinarily rare to preserve. My personal feeling is that this is actually a very thin membrane and probably rather thinner than the others because it so rarely preserves. I tried writing a paper on this years and years ago and then it just never got done. And yeah, the other weird thing about these two is they look almost identical. They're preserved in almost perfectly identical postures, despite coming from different quarries. If you see, so there's some lovely photos of them. Peter Vellenhofer did this famous book in 1991, the Encyclopedia of Pterosaurs, which you can still get. It's completely out of print, but it's sold brilliantly. So there's loads of second-hand copies online. You can get it for about 10 quid. And it's still in print in some other languages. My parents, probably 10 years ago now, went to Bilbao or Vienna, I can't remember, or Rome, so somewhere like that.
I'm going to interrupt a story to say this whole thing about Aerodactylus and Pterodactylus being very similar, but Rome, Vienna, same thing.
I got some random email from my mother. Something like 7 or 8 years ago. So yes, I can't remember exactly where they'd gone.
I know.
And said, "Oh, we've gone to the museum. We're in the gift shop, and here is an X language translation of that pterosaur book I know you talk about. Do you want us to buy a copy?" It's like, well, no, because I've got 2 different copies of it in English already. I don't really need one that was in Italian or Spanish or something. But it was still in print. And actually, despite being now, 91, 30 years old, a lot of the, I'd say 90+% of the core information is basically correct. It's extremely good. If you're out there, pick up a copy. But if you look, there's some black and white photos of these 2 specimens in that book, and they look identical. And actually, I was lucky enough back in, 2007-8? I organised a conference in Munich where one of these specimens is held. So there's the holotype specimen, which is in Munich, but then Munich's other great one is this, and it's the Munich Pterodactylus. That's what everyone calls it, because, of course, Aerodactylus. Anyway, but the Munich Pterodactylus. And I had a colleague coming up from Vienna, and Vienna has the Vienna Pterodactylus, which is the other one. And I went, can you bring it? And we found some money, we got some sponsorship, we paid for the insurance because this thing's worth a ton of money, and we take it over a border, and brought it to Munich. And I've got a photo in my collection. I put it out on Twitter last year of the two of them side by side. To my knowledge, it's the only time in their history they've been in the same room. And we got to put them next to each other. And it's remarkable how they're the same size, they're in the same pose with the same posture on almost every single bone, but one of them is in really quite a grey rock, and then the bones themselves are grey, and then the other is really quite a bright kind of khaki, but with loads of brown speckles in it, and the bone is brown. And you can see just how different the local preservation was for the two, and yet he's captured these two animals that are almost identical. And then, of course, as you know, this is coming. Those are now both considered Aerodactylus. And so the Munich Pterodactylus and the Vienna Pterodactylus are, if they are correct, and that is, of course, the big question, are not Pterodactylus at all.
Oh, okay, I have a few questions about this. First off, are they roughly the same age, those specimens? Do you know?
Do you mean a geological or...
Yes.
So Solnhofen is a fairly short period of time. At this point, anyone who really knows Solnhofen will be screaming at their computer or phone or thing of choice.
That's like one person. Well done if it's you.
Probably. Hi, Christian. So Solnhofen is often used, and the sense in which I am using it right now, for the whole kind of region and actually covering quite a few different areas and even some quite differently aged rocks. Whereas, if you like, almost like Solnhofen formation proper in a technical sense is rather narrower. In this case, both are simultaneously correct in that actually all of Pterodactylus and indeed all of Rhamphorhynchus and a whole bunch of these other things are all just from the Solnhofen formation. So that it is actually a relatively restricted band of rock. But even when you start including these other associated ones, which are part of the geographic region, so things like Bella Brunus, the little thing I named, this is from a thing called Brunn, which is a little older. You know, it's still nearby physically, and it is not much older geologically. Compared to some of the things that we've talked about, for example, Tyrannosaurus spread 2.5 million years, some people would say 3. We're talking about 500,000 years. This is a narrow window where this stuff was basically forming fossils. Those two are not the exact same age, but they are very, very similar, and more similar than almost everything else we've ever talked about when we've argued about taxonomy on this podcast. I mean, they're that close together.
Okay, so I'm not going to ask you the difference between Pterodactylus and Aerodactylus because there'll be a measurement involved, and I don't care.
Yes, it's subtleties of ratios of bone lengths.
Other than the size and the fact they've got a long neck and they've got a short tail, what does Pterodactylus look like? What is its? It had occurred to me about 10 minutes ago while I was monologuing quite happy. I haven't actually said anything about what it looks like other than it's about a metre in wingspan. In its way, it's a fairly classic pterodactyloid. So, you've got a head that's about the same length as the neck, which is a little bit longer than the body. It's got a relatively, really quite a short tail. It's got kind of mid-length legs. So when we get into Pteranodon and its relatives, some of them have rather diddy legs because they're very, very big flyers. I want to talk about Ashdarchids at some point, the really giant pterosaurs, and they have very long legs. The Tinochasmatids are somewhere in between. Tinochasmatids. I've got to keep remembering that name.
I know. They really are shorebird analogues. I mean, I mentioned gulls earlier. They're not the best thing. But certainly they are filling the niche that a lot of our modern shorebirds do, because the one thing that the Tinochasmatids have is they have lots of very small teeth. And in the extreme cases, there's a thing called Terra Dostro. That name possibly ring a bell?
For me, no, but he sounds like a great catch. I mean, he sounds beautiful.
Terra Dostro is the, inverted commas, flamingo pterosaur. So Terra Dostro is from South America. It's Argentine. It's actually one of these animals where we've got very young juveniles all the way up to adults. And they have actually quite a nice, slightly U-shaped jaw, so it does curve quite deeply along its length, not what pterosaurs usually go for. Usually a nice kind of straight nose or straight beak. And they have, I want to say it's something like 1,000 teeth. What? It's a very, very, very high number. Incredibly spindly things sitting in the jaw, pretty much just in the lower jaw. I think the upper jaw doesn't have any.
So we're talking like, filter feeders.
Most of the Tinochasmatids are either predators of small things or filter feeders. Terra Dostro is the extreme example of that. It's a South American thing that lived in hypersaline lakes. There's the filter feeder with a curved jaw with 1,000 teeth in it. It's a reason we call it a flamingo. There's lots of illustrations of this being coloured pink for that exact reason. And for the record, they are teeth. So for quite a long time, people are like, these can't be teeth. They must, they're so thin and spindly. Teeth don't grow like that. They have to be some kind of
keratin or something.
Keratin, yeah. It's a weird divided beak. And there's loads of birds and ducks and like mergansers and stuff like this that have these kind of teethy things. And no, people went and sectioned one and stuck it under a microscope. No, it's enamel. They are teeth. Look up Terra Dostro. It's wonderful. So Terra Dostro is the extreme example. In the Solnhofen, living alongside Pterodactylus, we have things like Tinochasma, so that's where the group gets its name, and that has a shape of a jaw literally like a spoonbill. A bird. I just realised not everyone may know what spoonbills look like.
This is true. But they can imagine from the word spoon, bill, what its face looks like.
It's long and straight, and then it expands a bit at the end, a bit like a spoon, with teeth, in the case of Tinochasma, sticking out basically sideways, like sideways out of the jaw.
Ooh, like a chainsaw.
Yeah, pretty much. So there's a couple of them. There's several Tinochasmatids, including Tinochasma, which has like that, with, again, loads and loads and loads and loads of teeth in it.
So is that for filter feeding again? Is that for going over the surface, or is that for digging in the ground?
My suspicion is they're at least partially compressed, because you flattened everything, and if you're going to flatten a skull that way, the teeth are going to go out sideways. But it's notable for everyone that I've seen, all the teeth go out perfectly in an edge, and you'd think that some of them would go wonky and fold back underneath, or go the other way, or end up crossing each other. And none of them do,
Weird.
Which makes you think that it is genuinely a lateral projection of the teeth, which would be weird. But maybe it's doing something like a sawfish. Maybe it's finding little pools and ponds and sticking its beak in and just thrashing its head around and then just scooping up whatever it's spite. I mean,
or maybe it's a way of, like, teeth are sensitive, so maybe it's a way of sensing the water. Or
I doubt it's electroreception, because that's really pretty rare. But it could be doing. It's almost certainly doing something weird. So Pterodactylus is part of this group, which are mostly shoreline filter feeders, grabbing small stuff from the shallows or something like that.
You wouldn't take your chips out on the beach with a Pterodactylus.
No.
It's going to get it.
But that's the thing. Pterodactylus is therefore unusual in that regard, is that it's nothing like as exaggerated as these others, with either a very long nose or huge numbers of teeth. It's got lots of small teeth, but they're fairly simple and triangular and just point up and down. It does have a long, narrow, I was going to say beak, doesn't have a beak because there's no keratin on it, but long, slender snout. And our interpretation of it is some kind of, generalist shoreline feeder. So there's a couple of them, I want to say, with fish inside them. Little fish, but fish inside them. So they're probably grabbing some fish. I suspect what it's mostly doing is probing, and lots of people have talked about this. It's something like a plover or something like an oyster catcher. It's paddling along the beach, and it's sticking its snout down into sand or mud or whatever and fishing around, and it's grabbing lugworms and small crustaceans, and yes, it's grabbing fish and crabs out of rock pools, or here's a dead dinosaur on a beach, it's going to take some chunks out of that.
Would it be able to, though? Because, if it's a big dinosaur, if you look at the beaks of, like, scavenging birds, for example, they're very hooked and they're able to rip meat away. Is that possible when you've got little...
it would be bad at getting through stuff like skin, but once a carcass is broken open, and particularly when you've got very softy stuff like intestines, and even more so when they've been sitting in the sea for a week, it's probably rather easier to get
tasty.
But the general point being that it's some kind of generalist little predator that is grabbing whatever it can. And again, in that regard, it is quite unusual for a Tinochasmatid, who are usually much more filtery than this one is.
I'm going to ask, because, I mean, you say it's sort of like, because when I think of these birds which are doing similar jobs, they are quite good on their hind legs. They're quite good at wading, they're quite good at... I mean, they weren't walking around on their hind legs, they were using all four legs.
Yes, but with fairly big feet, actually.
Okay.
So that's, the interpretation there is that that's good for walking on soft surfaces so that you don't sink into them, and also potentially therefore swimming. So I want to talk about locomotion in pterosaurs on land, sea and air properly in another episode.
Well, we've got no evidence that their feet were webbed or anything.
We do, because we have preserved webbed feet for at least a couple of pterosaurs.
That's cool.
What I will say, though, and ironically this goes back to my last Spinosaurus paper, because I wrote about that as well. Webbing isn't the same as swimming. So flamingos are appalling swimmers and have some webbing between their toes, because webbing is good for swimming. It's also very good for not sinking into mud.
Like snowshoes.
I was going to say snowshoes is where I was going with this. Yes, it's the same thing for exactly the same reason. So webbing doesn't mean swimming, but it does usually mean hanging around the water. So yeah, Pterodactylus, it is perhaps, half gull, half oyster catcher, half lapwing. Actually, lapwing's probably quite a good one for the beak length, because plovers have really short beaks. Something like that. Pretty decent flyer. We find them well off the coastline, so it's not like they're just sitting on the shore. They're probably flying around. But yeah, we think they're probably around in very large numbers, given the number of specimens that we find. And yeah, this is one thing that you do see in some of the paleo art, but rarely, and I can understand why, because painting one animal is a pain, painting 500 is an absolute nightmare. But, there's very little artwork of pterosaurs in the kind of flocks that actually we imagine a lot of the time they were in. And for something like this in particular, they with lots of food on the beach, and every time the tide comes in and out, that's probably what happens is, tens, hundreds, thousands, hundreds of thousands. Who knows? These things were probably descending and foraging around. We do have footprints. We do have probe marks of jaws going into sand. Obviously, we can't directly refer them to Pterodactylus, but we have big-footed and therefore probably small animals with big feet that are probably Tinochasmatids, therefore, running around on mud with occasional little, vertical pock marks by the feet, which looks like they've stuck their snout in.
I have several questions. First one is, I've forgotten when we're talking.
Oh, so no, I never said. So Pterodactylus, at least in the Solnhofen as a whole, is late Jurassic. Okay,
cool. So I consider very early. Because Cretaceous is...
The Cretaceous is, as a whole, is as long as the Jurassic and Triassic together. So, yes, it is.
Exactly.
It is kind of in the early half of the first half of the Mesozoic as a whole.
And the other thing is, a lot of people associate pterosaurs with crests and things like that. Does Pterodactylus have any sort of headgear going on?
We don't have any soft tissue ones preserved. What we do have in a couple of them is this kind of midline filigree bone on the head, which we know from some other specimens a soft tissue crest does attach to it. So
they do. So if they've got a crest, presumably you're a sexual selection man. We're presuming it's for that sort of stuff.
It is. So not in Pterodactylus itself, but in Darwinopterus. So a Chinese animal that is not a Tinochasmatid, though its head at least looks remarkably like that of Pterodactylus. So there we do have distinct morphs that we can recognise, where you have a larger animal with that filigree bone, which we know a crest attaches to, which we consider a male, and a slightly smaller animal which lacks that crest and has a broad pelvis, which makes sense for laying eggs, that we regard as being a female, and at least one of those females has an egg inside it, which is a bit of a giveaway.
Could have been a hungry bloke who didn't have a very good digestive system.
Yeah, there's an egg behind it as well, actually.
Yeah.
We've at least got a... So I was about to say fairly close relative. Those who know their pterosaurs can judge how fairly, I'm using the word fairly close relative. A not too distant relative with a very similar head shape and apparently with the same crest support, which is sexually dimorphic. Yeah. Whether or not that truly applies to Pterodactylus itself or even Aerodactylus, yeah.
Or on some BBC shows, it might be all pterosaurs.
Yeah, let's let's not go to
As a definite fact.
Yes.
Definite.
Anyway. So yeah, that's pretty much Pterodactylus.
Well, I want to know, no, it's not, because we haven't talked about, like, if they were scaly, if they had feathers.
Well, that's a more general pterosaur thing rather than Pterodactylus itself. So I don't know if you.
I know we discussed it a little bit with Rhamphorhynchus, but I think that it's something that, you know. Is there evidence of it? Are we assuming they're covered in the same little filaments?
We are. So as a rule, all pterosaurs had filamentous body coverings, which I was on the original paper, which formally named these as pycnofibers. A lot of people, particularly there was a paper only came out like 4 or 5 weeks ago at the time of recording, that has increasingly argued that they are true feathers. In other words, they have a homology, is the correct word, with dinosaur feathers. That is, there is a single shared ancestry somewhere at the origin of pterosaurs and dinosaurs combined. Feathers existed and was inherited by both groups, and therefore they are literally the same thing. And we should call...
So they didn't evolve them
we should call pterosaur filaments feathers. I'm very open to that possibility. I'm unconvinced with the arguments to date, because the arguments to date go down to they kind of look like them. Well, of course they do. That's kind of what you'd expect. I think we need a little bit more than that. Not least when we know we've got various scaly things down at that base anyway. So it doesn't really matter. Either way, whatever you want to call them, they were filamented. Now, on the one hand, the number of filamentous pterosaurs that we've got, in other words, actual specimens that are preserving that filamentous covering, half a dozen. It's really not very many at all. But what it is really spaced out across the pterosaur tree. They're not all clustered in one little group. They're all over the pterosaur tree. They cover a huge swathe of time, lots of different places, lots of different groups with very different ecology, living in very different times and places. That's exactly the kind of pattern you'd expect for something which is basically universal. And therefore, it's pretty reasonable to infer that despite the very low numbers of actual specimens, as a default, your pterosaurs were fluffy.
So I'm picturing them, when I pictured them, as almost being like a sort of like sheen on them, rather than like a modern bird being very fluffy. Is that wrong?
Well,
do you think
that's where we don't really know? So, I mean, probably the best preserved one is this thing called Jailopterus from China, and anurignated, and I want to do an anurignated episode, so I don't want to go into that too much. But certainly the filaments on that, it looks like wet dog. You know, they're all kind of everywhere. But we have some feathers that look like that for birds preserved in those environments. Because, again, if you dunk a bird in water and it drowns and it's just floating around for days, curiously enough, it's not perfectly groomed and smoothed down and looks lovely. So it's really quite hard to know. I would say that, you know, there's lots of domestic breeds that do this, but if you look at wild animals, there are not many, whether they're birds or mammals, that have kind of very rough, like, fur
shaggy
patches and are naturally shaggy and uneven and like, look unbrushed, even when they have groomed themselves. That's not normal at all. And so I'd find it very odd if that was the normal appearance of pterosaurs, particularly when they're flying and you do get into things like, boundary effects and lift and drag. You want smooth airflow. It's effort if you are shaggy and rough with your feathers or filaments flapping around all over the place. So I really doubt they were like that.
Also, because this has come up, we've talked a bit about this in our sort of cold-blooded, warm-blooded thing, but because people think pterosaur, they were lizards, they also assume, especially because they're small, Pterodactylus is a small one, that they will be more reliant on maybe the sun's rays for helping, warm themselves up and things like that, and having a lot of feathers might dampen that effect. But can you talk about that?
Well, it's the opposite way round, is that they're almost certainly hot, and therefore you need insulation to keep that heat in. Now that we're increasingly sure, I mean, we're sure at this point, but when I was doing my PhD I handed it in 2004, 2005, we weren't that sure that pterosaurs were that close to dinosaurs. That was what my thesis was on, is basically, are pterosaurs dinosaur sister taxa or not? The answer after 3 years research was, don't know. Which is where we were, don't know, but probably, which is where we were before I started. That's how science works, kids. But at that point, I'd say, there were several important people who were on the fence, including Chris Bennett, actually, I don't know what its current position is, to be honest, but till even fairly recently was not happy with the idea that pterosaurs were close to dinosaurs, and he thought they were rather earlier reptiles. And he wasn't the only one. So I'd say probably 70-80% of the pterosaur researchers like, yeah, they're probably very close to dinosaurs, but we don't actually really know. And there's a strong possibility that they're not. Coupled with what's the physiology of early dinosaurs, well, they might be warm-blooded, but we don't really know. So you put those two together, and the actual physiology of pterosaurs was extremely uncertain. But now that we're, 99% sure that pterosaurs are extremely close to dinosaurs, and now we're probably more like 95% sure that the earliest dinosaurs were warm-blooded, and therefore their immediate ancestors were too. And suddenly, hot pterosaurs is pretty much the default and obvious answer. And that does make a lot of sense for a powered flying animal. And when you've got some of the Triassic pterosaurs, being properly oceanic animals, which probably can't rely on the sun's rays to get going when you're in the middle of the Atlantic, or the equivalent.
I mean, it would explain why you get so many of them in the ocean, though, if they're powering down in the ocean and just sinking.
That's where we are. Pterosaurs they have a high thermal physiology. They're warm animals, and this.
So you would expect them, therefore, their filaments to be insulated, and they could have been quite floofy, not as in shaggy, but had a lot of extra.
Yeah. So there's been some illustrations of some pterosaurs looking not quite like puffballs, but. Certainly, if you drew the skeleton out and then, put the artwork as a transparency over the top, you'd see it's a much, much bigger animal, which again is what we see with an awful lot of birds.
Owls.
Owls. That's exactly the one I was going for. But even things like pigeons. Where anyone who's picked up a live chicken, your hands just sink in, and you go, oh right, there's actually quite a lot of outside here before I get to the bird that I'm picking up. And they're probably very similar in that regard. So there was a Twitter. Would you believe there was a Twitter spat?
Really?
Someone had drawn an Ashdakid. They have very long necks and really quite thin necks. And someone had drawn it with this enormous fat neck and said, well, I've just drawn it with a really fluffy neck. And that's right. They'd put it on Wikipedia. So they'd done free art and uploaded it. And some picky editor had taken it down going, you haven't drawn the neck properly. And it's but it's filaments. That's what they could have looked like. And put this on Twitter. And me and Mark Whitten and a whole bunch of other pterosaur researchers and artists went, well, that's perfectly reasonable. It looks ludicrous because it looks like you put this enormous thing on the front of your pterosaur, but it's not. If it's all just filaments, it would look massive whilst weighing basically nothing. That's perfectly reasonable.
I like this idea. I mean, the aerodynamics of having that skin membrane, would that have been covered in feathers as well? I mean, not feathers, sorry, filaments.
There is a big question. Jailopterus, which I mentioned a few minutes ago, is the really one very fluffy specimen that we've got, appears to have a few filaments on the wing membrane, but only very close to the body. So it, maybe it extends out into the early
armpit hair,
pretty much actually. But for the membrane as a whole, apparently not.
So like a bat, really, if we think of them like bats, because bats are furry.
In that regard, yes.
Okay, cool.
I'm just being careful because in lots of ways, I think bats are quite good analogues for some bits of pterosaur biology. And I've had real arguments with other scientists. I was going to say who will remain nameless, but they're literally nameless because they're anonymous referees on papers going, you can't use bats for this. It's like, well, you can, because birds might be a closer relative and they might fly, but birds are flying in a very different way and under very different selection pressures and yada, 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 yada. And for this bit, I think bats are an awful lot more useful.
And Scansoriopterigids.
Yes, indeed. It just means I'm very careful about when I say, just like a bat, because there is this kind of trope of membrane-winged pterosaurs are bats. And that's what you get is pterosaurs are flying dinosaurs and they're not. And then it becomes, so pterosaurs are the ancestors of birds. No, because birds are dinosaurs and pterosaurs are not dinosaurs. And then the third one you get is, are they linked to bats somehow? And it's like, well, no, they're not that either.
They're more linked to...
They just fly.
They are more linked to birds, but they're not, no.
They're obviously much closer to birds than to bats. They're near enough, both dinosaurs, which compared to a mammal is a long, 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 long way away. But yeah, they are structured more similarly in a lot of ways.
But other than it just being the first, sample that we got, that's the reason that we use the word pterodactyl and people do, is just because it was the first one made famous.
Well, as you'll know from your history stuff, when something new comes along, whatever the first name that gets tacked onto it is immediately the name that everyone uses. And particularly things like, Hoover and Xerox. You get company names become associated with an item because it's the only one, and so it becomes automatically synonymous. So it is true, but also, as I sort of hinted, it's impossible to know, the Terry Pratchett's trousers of time, we go down the other leg, but what would have happened if that first prominent specimen had been a fraction as well preserved as it was? Like, it didn't have the head or it didn't have the wings, which a whole bunch of Solnhofen ones don't. It would never have had the interest. It would never have had the attention. Yeah, the others would have turned up sooner or later, but no one would have got that interested in them without Cuvier taking an interest in his fame and influence. It would have been a lot less certain what it was. I don't pretend the whole field of pterosaurs would have been different, but certainly that early interest probably would never have been there, and that at least partly prompted a lot of the early excavations and sales and getting specimens into other museums, and that still resonates today. I did this paper. The Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh bought a collection of a Belgian, he's like a Belgian count or marquis or earl or something like this, who basically went bankrupt. I've got a sneaking suspicion. It's actually in my own paper, and I have to go back and read it again. But it was something like he was getting married, or he had a mistress and needed to buy her a new country house. And so he'd accrued this enormous collection of Solnhofen specimens and basically flogged the lot to the Carnegie Museum in one go. But the Carnegie has the biggest and best pterosaur collection, or at least of German material, outside of Germany. London's got 3 or 4, Paris has got a couple, Kiel's got a few, Vienna's got 4, there's 3 in Hungary, and then the Carnegie's got 15 of them. It's a massive research collection, and yet it's almost entirely unresearched. But it would, no one would have bought these. No one would have been interested in them, and then no one would have sold them on if there hadn't been that early interest. So I think it does. There is a potentially neat historical quirk to pterosaur research that such a good specimen turned up so early. And I would still put the holotype Pterodactylus as, probably one of the top, 15 or 20 specimens, full stop. It's that good for pterosaurs, and yet it's like the first one. Again, not technically, but close enough. Really, really quite important in that regard. And of course, and therefore that allowed us to do, is it flying? Yes. Does it have hollow bones? Yes. Is it a reptile? Definitely. And all of that came because it was so good.
Well, I have a head buzzing full of more questions, but we've got an entire series pretty much, haven't we, Dave, to go through it all. So we will visit...
That's my plan.
We will visit other squawky squawks later. We should have, instead of having our official ending of a rar, because, and I should also add, big thank you to our patrons. You're amazing. Thanks for sticking to us over the gap. We are here for you and because of you, and thank you. And if you're not a patron, do consider it, because it is a great way to support us. If you can't afford it, that's all right. Don't worry. Just share this episode with your friends, etc. If you hated it, though, tell your enemies you enjoyed it. And then they'll have to listen. I don't know what I'm on about. Anyway, the point is, Dave, we need, instead of a sort of rar ending, we need a ending.
That's quite terrifying.
It's a pterosaur.
I guessed where you were going with this, but I assumed it was going to be a squawk or a rack, whereas that was really quite...
That's what they sounded like. It's...
That genuinely sounds very close to what my memory would be of the pterosaur sound effects from 1 million years BC.
There you go, you see? That's because I'm that old and they got me in to go...
When was that? 1964?
That's fine. I've aged well. All right then, after 3 there, Dave. Until next week.
Yeah, I think they know which was which on that.
Thank you for downloading this episode of Terrible Lizards. To support us, please become a patron on patreon.com/Terrible Lizards. If you can't do that, don't worry. Just leave us an amazing review on your podcast app. Also, you can check us out on Twitter. I am ISZI_LAWRENCE and Dave is DAVE_HONE. You can also check out our books. Dave's got a load of dinosaur ones. I've got a load of children's ones. I also do other podcasts as well. Go to ISZI.com. If you have dinosaur questions, you're going to want to email terriblelizardspod@gmail.com. That way we can answer them in the questions episode. I think that's all I have time to tell you, but thank you if you support the show already. You are amazing. We will see you next time.